So there's a couple of other topics that I would like to discuss today during our conversation. So I'd like to move on beyond the paleo diet, as interesting as it may be. So let me go to some of the latest work that you guys have been doing at the Institute for Emergent IEET.
Yeah, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies.
Exactly. Thank you. And more specifically, the work related to, I think if the term is correct, the human equivalent non-person rights.
That's right. A little about a year or so ago, and this has been something that I've been thinking about for many, many years, is what's referred to, stepping even back even further, is this whole issue behind personhood theory. And that is, okay, what is a person? And it's this acknowledgement that not all persons are humans and not all humans are persons, that really what we're talking about are criteria-based distinctions, that's what gives rise to personhood, that there's a threshold or even a spectrum, with which we have persons. So it got me, and I got thinking about this, from the perspective as a bioethicist, and thinking, let's say we have somebody like the Terry Schiavo case, where we have a person who's in a profoundly vegetative state. Post-mortem autopsy revealed that she had a brain that had shrunk to the size of a walnut. Like there was nothing happening there. There was no seat of consciousness, if you will, in subjectivity. So in that sense, that's not a person. That's not somebody who's engaging in the world, not receiving any input, and so forth. As distasteful as that might seem to some people, particularly from traditional backgrounds, from a practical standpoint, that does not qualify in the same way that a fully robust person does, which could be, for example, a non-human. So if you look at the great apes, for example, even the cetaceans like dolphins and whales, and I think elephants, when you start to look at them, look at their behavior, even study, go deep inside their brain, and basically we're able to map the same kinds of functions that, in terms of their ability to forge relationships, even the theory of other mind, is we're finding quite startlingly that they're very similar to our own in terms of our capacity. So we have no choice at this point. We cannot really withhold our consent anymore when it comes to saying, hey, look, they're persons in the same way that we as humans are persons. So the implication there, what it occurred to me, was that we start to need to be looking out for their rights, perhaps in a way that's a bit deeper than we have. And I have to admit, I'm very much inspired by the work of the Princeton bioethicist Peter Singer, who started the Great Ape Project many years ago. And he's essentially looking for the same thing, which is human equivalent rights for the great apes. And I know that there's some other groups out there looking for, let's say, dolphin personhood and so on. But I quickly realized that there's no group out there that's looking out for the welfare of all persons, whatever they may be. So that's what we did. So about a year or so ago, we started at the IEET, we started this program called the Rights of the Non-Human Persons Program. And what we're trying to do is exactly that, secure human equivalent rights for these animals. And what we mean by that, it's mostly protections based. So we're not necessarily saying they should have the right to vote, for example, and do those sorts of things. Clearly, capacities being what they are, there are some limitations. But for the same reason, we don't, for example, say that let's say a profoundly disabled person is not a person. We have to look at it for that same kind of frame. But what we are saying is that these animals should not be confined to zoos. They should not be made to perform tricks at aquatic centers. They should not be confined to spaces experimented upon. Could be illicit trading of them. These are off the table. The most simple way of putting it is, look, if you wouldn't do it to a human, you wouldn't do it to one of these animals as well. So that's. Mm-hmm.
So which are these animals that you're talking about, other than apes and perhaps
That's
dolphins?
It's a very short list. So all the great apes, including bonobos and chimpanzees. We also have all the dolphins and all the whales, and elephants. There are other candidate species that we're looking into, such, for example, Ben Gur. Yes, actually. And that's a very strange case because it's non-mammalian and very alien, if you will, aquatic. Well, not that the dolphin isn't aquatic, but the dolphin is an aquatic mammal. This is purely, these cephalopods. And I'm sure many of your podcast listeners are aware that the octopus behavior is very complex. I mean, they've been known to be very mischievous and playful, and they can engage in problem solving. And that's certainly an area that we need to explore a bit further. So there's the encephalopods, and then as well, Ben Gerstle brought to my attention. He's very much a supporter of this program, but he said you better include the African gray parrot. And so I looked into it. I looked into it. I think, sure enough, they are astounding.
It's one of his hobbies.
Yes, and some of the best studies reveal that they actually have about the human equivalent of about a 3 to 4 year old child, which is significant, and that I think would qualify really as a person clearly. And so these are ones that are kind of the outliers that what I'd like to do, given more resources and more time, is to actually get into the science here. What we need is a neurological, not just like an empirical kind of understanding, but an actual neurological understanding of what are the seats of personhood, what are the maps of personhood cognitively, what are the parts of the brain that we can look at and say, aha, this animal has that, therefore, it needs to be part of this whole list of criteria that make up a person. Then let me give you an example. We have mirror neurons in our brain. What the mirror neurons do, it's what actually enables you to be able to have a theory of other mind. Like, Nicola, I know that you're a conscious being. I'm not about to insult you or hurt your feelings, because I know why would I do that? I know that I have this feeling. I can empathize with you and have these associations. Now, as much as we like to think that I was taught that, that's not entirely the case. That's actually a cognitive capacity that you have as a result of the mirror neurons. That's why they're referred to as mirror neurons. It enables you to kind of mirror yourself and to see yourself, so to speak, in another person or another creature. And what we've discovered as well is when we've studied the brains of, let's say, whales, for example, is we've discovered that they have the exact same cells, these mirror neurons, and they're actually identical. So we know that the whales must therefore have a theory of other minds and must also be considerate towards each other and their feelings and so on. So that's definitely, check that off the list. That's one of maybe several criteria, and these are the things that we have to work on, is, okay, what are all the various criteria that make up a person, both from a behavioral perspective in terms of what we observe them doing, but also from a neurological perspective in terms of what their latent capacities are as thinking and considerate and social and emotional creatures. So I would, and maybe the African gray parrot and encephalopods aren't the limit as well. I suspect that there actually may be more personhood candidates out there. What we need to do is just start off with a small group, because it's not only is this a scientific problem, it's also a social problem, because we have to get buy-in right now on the whole idea of there being non-human persons, because that's actually right now a very radical idea. Because right now most people will just say, how dare you say such a thing? The only people that can the only persons that exist out there are humans, and that this is an indignity to humanity. This demeans us and makes us look like another animal in the forest, and that lessens what it means to be a human being. And I think we have to get rid of that speciesist attitude. And if anything, I think that if we were to recognize, let's say, that dolphins are persons, actually that's my prediction, is that dolphins will be the first, and orca whales potentially, because the orca whale actually is a dolphin. It's a subspecies of dolphin, that they will be the first non-human persons recognized. And in fact, PETA just recently, I think a couple of weeks ago, this being February of 2012, they had a very interesting lawsuit against SeaWorld, where they named 5 plaintiffs, specifically 5 orca whales by name. And of course, they were represented by a lawyer. And what they were saying was that they actually deserved to be protected by the U.S. Constitution, specifically the 13th Amendment, which forbids slavery. And that the case that they were making was that they are actually enslaved, and they're being forced to perform these tricks, according to their schedule, and also forced to be confined in these ridiculously small spaces. You take an average orca whale, it swims 100 kilometers a day, and to be forced into these claustrophobic tanks must be unbelievably difficult for them, and I'm sure no small cause of both extreme confinement and depression amongst these creatures. So what made this case particularly important, not just the fact that they actually went through with this, was that a judge actually listened to this case, and he heard the arguments both for and against. Of course, the SeaWorld lawyer was saying that this is a waste of time and ludicrous, and saying that that invoking even slippery slope arguments, saying that if we allow this, then eventually, we won't be able to allow sniffing dogs sniff for bombs and drugs. So this kind of guilt by association, or this kind of way to distract perhaps the issue at hand. I think frustratingly, when the verdict came down, the judge said that very explicitly, he said animals are not persons. And it was the explicitness of that language that actually astounded me, because it tells me a couple of things. One, we still got ways to go, but two, he actually gets it. That judge understood fundamentally what the issue was, and he was not prepared to make that precedent yet, because he knew what the implications would be. So to me, that's actually a huge victory, because that means that the next case may lose, the next case may lose, but we're going to get there eventually, where this is going to be a normative idea. Sorry, this is a normative concept that will have to be phased into public acceptance and social acceptance, such that we can come to become comfortable with the idea that we can have animals out there that are also considered persons and protected by some fundamental rights.
George, you just mentioned the sort of some of the neurological requirements that would allow you to place certain species on that list. But what about the emotional ones? What about suffering, or and more specifically, the suffering of say animals that we can observe in our daily lives, like our pets? Mm-hmm. Many of us have dogs and cats, and there's an annual global outcry about Canada's, annual hunt for seals and stuff like that. Why shouldn't we put animals like seals or dogs and cats on that list? They are exhibiting all the elements of emotional suffering associated with death and so on, or when they're wounded and, not killed on the first shot or whatever. Horrible suffering, really. And why shouldn't we place them on that list?
It's an excellent question, and it's one I'm asked quite often, particularly pet lovers. My cats, the first argument you get is, my cat has such a personality, and such, like you said, even has emotional capacities, that why would you not, recognize that as a person? And I'm actually very sympathetic to that. I do believe there can be such a thing as a dog person and a cat person. We have to kind of lose a certain kind of anthropomorphism about this. What I don't necessarily mean to say is that the more like humans that they are, the better that they are, or the more like persons that they are. Really, this is a hard concept to kind of convince people of, but I'm trying to be as non-anthro about this as possible, and saying we're simply looking for a specific set of criteria, a certain set of characteristics that lead to these kinds of endowments and behaviors and so on. That's so. My first priority here, as the program founder here, is to get initial buy-in for a very select group of animals. These are kind of like, in my idea, like the no-brainers. Particularly the dolphin, like it's always got a smiley face. It's cute. We don't like, people are getting increasingly sensitive to seeing them having to perform at these aquatic centers. That's the baby steps approach that I have. That the first thing we have to do is get acceptance about that. I totally suspect that given success in that particular area, we can continue to push the boundaries of what we can do in terms of the protections of other animals as well. And I look at personhood as not a binary thing. I don't think it's like you either are or you're not. I do kind of see it more along the lines of a spectrum, that essentially, that even if you are, let's say, in the lower end of the spectrum in terms of your capacities, that you still have deserving, let's say, of a certain set of rights and freedoms. Maybe not all of them. This might sound maybe prejudicial on my part. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, and somebody can maybe put about a more elegant kind of solution, a more sophisticated solution than what I've got what I'm posing here. But essentially, that exactly what you're suggesting is that maybe an enhanced set or an increased sense of how we can protect these particular animals, and maybe even change the terminology with which we use to describe them as being a subset of persons or a kind of person. And I do believe specifically we need to do that through the frame of their species. So say, this is a dog person, this is a cat person, this is a pig person, and so on. And that would be totally fine with me. So I think that's kind of like phase 2.0, maybe even phase 3.0 of our project. But what I want to assure your listeners is that I am sympathetic to that, and that's on my to-do list. So eventually we'll get there.